Hello everyone, this is Mark Hammonds from MobileTuts Plus, and welcome to the second post in our series on beginning iOS development. In today's lesson, we're going to build a simple iOS application called FortuneCrunch. I designed FortuneCrunch to be the hello world of iPhone programming. It provides just enough detail for you to begin to understand the Xcode and Interface Builder workflow, the fundamentals of Objective-C syntax, and how to respond to button actions. Let's begin by starting Xcode. Xcode is Apple's proprietary integrated development environment, or IDE. As such, it includes all the tools you'll need to start building native iPhone applications. Begin by selecting Create a new Xcode project. As you can see, you're now presented with a list of different iOS application templates. Each template is tailored for a different kind of application. So we have navigation-based applications, OpenGLS applications, split view application, tab bar, etc. For this tutorial, we're going to use a view-based application, but I encourage you to familiarize yourself with the other templates by just reading the text descriptions provided in Xcode. Enter the name FortuneCrunch and click Save. Welcome to Xcode. We'll cover Xcode more fully in a future tutorial, but for now, I really just want you to familiarize yourself with the three main content areas presented. The Groups and Files pane is a listing of all the files in your project. If you select a folder, you'll see all the files within it displayed to the right. And finally, when you select an individual file, you'll see its content displayed in the pane beneath. This is also your code editor, which you can enlarge by either dragging the pane up and down, like so, or by double-clicking and popping that out into a new window. Okay, so this is all pretty intuitive. Let's take a closer look at the Groups and Files pane though. The Classes folder is where almost all of your source code files will reside. As you might guess, this means that in Objective-C, you're almost always editing class files because virtually everything in your application is actually going to be an object. By default, the Other Sources folder holds two very important files, FortuneCrunch prefix.pch and main.m. If we open main.m in the editor, you'll see a function called int_main. And this is actually the function that's going to be called by the iOS operating system to launch your application. So when it comes to customizing your own code, int_main is actually ground zero for inserting your own customizations. That being said, you're very rarely actually going to edit this function. Next, we'll take a look at the FortuneCrunch prefix file. Now, the thing to remember about this file is that it's a great way to reduce carpal tunnel syndrome. And what I mean by that is that whatever you put between if-def Objective-C and indif here will actually be imported into all of the files across your project. So a very common convention is to add a constants file here, and then you can have your constant files imported automatically into everything else in your project without having to retype what the value of pi is equal to, for instance. And in case you're curious about what this actually means, this if-def, Objective-C, indif, these are actually called preprocessor directives, and essentially before your code begins to compile, these are checked to see if a condition is met, in this case, if Objective-C is defined. If it is, then it's going to import these two frameworks, and if not, nothing between this statement will execute. Next, we have the Resources folder. And the Resources folder is normally where you'll place your images, audio files, video files, as well as a special file called a zib file. And that's right here. You can see FortuneCrunch viewcontroller.zib. It's also sometimes pronounced as nib, and mainwindow.zib. So either one of these is actually normally managed by Interface Builder, and it's essentially a way to quickly modify and set up your interface without having to actually write any code. We also have a Frameworks folder that will list the available frameworks that you have in your project right now. Then we have a Products folder, and the Products folder is essentially where your application binary is stored or indicated. And you'll notice that right now it says FortuneCrunch.app, but it's actually red. That's because this binary is missing. There's nothing there. So we're going to go ahead and fix that by building and running this application. Select Build and Run. And we're actually in the iOS iPad simulator here. You may be as well. Nevertheless, you can see this is the basic application template, and it is quite boring. I'm going to change that. So these are our build settings essentially. We can see we're targeting the simulator, our configuration is debug, and we have by default here the iPad simulator 4.2 selected. We're going to change that to the iPhone simulator 4.2. Build and run again. And now you can see the iPhone simulator with, again, the default template that's not very interesting. Not to worry, we're going to fix that now. So let's go ahead and open the FortuneCrunch viewcontroller.zip file. Doing so will launch Interface Builder, as mentioned. Alright, you can see several different windows here. And the one in the back, kind of hiding, should look the most familiar. This is actually what we were just looking at in the simulator. And the correlation being that this window is actually the visual representation of the view that's managed by our FortuneCrunch View Controller class. So changes that we make to the view and interface builder will actually be reflected in the simulator and in the binaries that we build. For this reason, I like to think of this window as the canvas, not really in a strict artistic sense, but just because we can drag other items on top of it, we can change the color, and those changes will be reflected without having to write the code to do so. And speaking of objects that we can place on the canvas, this window is called the library, and it contains the various objects available to our zip file. So you can kind of browse through here and look at the various options available to you. And we'll experiment a little bit as well. You could drag a table view onto the canvas with a view. That's what a table view would look like. Or you could drag an image. You can size that image how you'd like it. And you could even put a text view object underneath. But for this tutorial, actually all we're going to use is a button. So you can filter your classes listed here by typing in the search box. You'll see several buttons come up. We actually want a very specific button, UI button. So this is the UI button class. We'll drag that onto our view. And now we have a button on the canvas. And one nice handy feature is that you can actually add text to your button very easily. But in truth, this is about as bad as a button can get aesthetically. It's really very plain and kind of dull looking. But if you select that button and you look at this other window called the inspector window, you'll notice that by default we have several different types of buttons that we can use. Right now we're using a rounded rect type, as you can see. We can actually change this to a detail disclosure, info light, which is that little eye you see, info dark, add contact, or the style we're going to use for this tutorial, custom. And custom allows you to configure how your button looks at the different button states available. And those states include a default state, a highlighted state, which occurs when you actually are pressing and holding down a button, a selected state, and a disabled state. For this tutorial, we're actually going to use the UI button to display a fortune cookie that's closed for the default state, and then when it highlights, it's going to change into a crunched cookie. And in order to do that, we need to import our images. So I actually paid to have Adam Miller from AE Tuts take 2 fortune cookie images specifically for this tutorial, and I've distributed those under a free license, so you can use it in your own projects or any modifications that you want are totally acceptable. And you can also download those in the project source file attached to this posting. After you've done so, I can show you how to actually import them into your project. Just clear away the desktop here. Alright, so your folder should look like this. And then when you open it, you should see these two images, cookie closed and cookie crunched. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to drag these cookie images over into the resources folder in Xcode. And you're going to get this dialog box that pops up. And it's really important that you take note of this checkbox at the top where it says copy items into destination groups folder. You want to select that, and what that's going to do is it's actually going to make a copy of the images and place them with your application rather than just linking to them. And that's the kind of error that you wouldn't actually find out about until you either deleted the files from your hard drive or you tried to build and run this as an application on the iPhone. Either way, it would be a very unpleasant surprise, so most of the time you want to be sure that you just select that checkbox and then click Add. Before we move on, let's take another look at that project folder. You'll see a third image as well, icon.ping, with capital I. We're going to drag that one into the resources folder as well. Make sure the checkbox is checked. Click Add. And now we have our application icon. Now by default, whatever image is titled icon.ping in the resources folder is what iOS will use for your dock icon. And you'll notice that this dock icon actually doesn't have any special effects to it. It's plain because those effects that you normally see, the gloss and whatnot, are applied by the iOS operating system, so you don't have to worry about that. In case you're wondering, the dimensions here are 57 by 57 pixels, and that's for iPhone 3G, 3GS, non-Retina display devices. For the Retina display, you would actually need to include a 114 by 114 pixel version, and you'd also have to make sure that the naming convention was set to be auto-imported for the Retina display. We're not going to get into that here. Okay, so with our project resources added, we're going to switch back to Interface Builder. Alright, so again with the custom button selected, be sure that's selected, we're going to change the image for the default state configuration to cookie-closed.ping. As you can see, we now have a very tiny Fortune cookie on our view. We want to make that the actual size of the image itself. So go to Layout, Size to Fit. You also note that the background here doesn't match the background of our image. So click off the button, select the view, and then go to the background attribute over here and change this to white. Okay, so that's looking a lot better. Alright, so we also want to add a UI label that's going to hold our Fortune. So you can drag that onto the view. And at this point a problem arises because we want to place the label over where the broken cookie is going to be. And to do that, we're going to have to actually switch this back from cookie closed temporarily to cookie crunched. I'm going to again go to Layout, Size to Fit. I'm going to drag this to make sure it's in the center of the screen. Then I'm going to take my label and place it directly on top of the Fortune paper. Alright, so from here you could give this any Fortune that you'd like. I'm going to use the text, Happy iPhone Hacking. Hit Enter. Not quite what I wanted. Again, Layout, Size to Fit is the answer. You can see that. Okay, so it obviously still needs some tweaking, and to do that we're going to change the font size, among other things. So select the font property here. You're presented this lovely list of fonts, as well as the ability to quickly change the font size. Go with 12 points, make it bold. And there's one thing that could be a bit tricky here. You'll notice that all of the system fonts you have available on Mac OS are going to be listed here. But the catch is that not all of these are going to be available on the iPhone OS. So when you're choosing a font, you have to be sure that you choose a font that's available by default with iOS or that you're going to add in programmatically. Alright, and I think the last time I opened a Fortune cookie, the text was actually not black, it was red. So we're going to change this to red as well. And then layout size to fit once more. And drag this into position. So that's what our cookie is going to look like when someone actually crunches it. Alright, so as mentioned, we actually only wanted to set this to the cookie crunched image so we could position the label. By default, we want it to be the cookie closed. We're going to change this now. Okay. And you'll notice that the label is still displayed on top, as it should be, but we don't want it to be visible when the view loads. So select the label again, and check this hidden box. That'll make it hidden when the view appears. Alright, so I think the last thing we're going to do here is select the button again, and then go to the highlighted state configuration. Now for the highlighted state, we want this to actually say cookie crunched, because we want it to immediately switch over to the crunched view. Okay, so we're ready to test our progress. Let's go ahead and select File, Save, and then go back to Xcode. And we're going to do Build and Run again. Only we didn't change the simulator. Unfortunate. Okay. So set this back to iPhone simulator. Build and run. Alright, and there's our view. Note that when you press down, the cookie crunched version of the image does show up, but it doesn't maintain its state, and we also don't see the UI label. Nonetheless, we're coming along. And our next step is to start coding the application. But before we do that, I actually want to give you a pro tip about zip files. Even though you will almost always edit zip files with Interface Builder, a zip file is really just an XML file that contains metadata about the objects that will be created automatically when the view controller is instantiated. You can see this if you select a zip file, and then Control-click, and say Open as source code file. And this should look very familiar to you if you've done any web development in the past. It's just a big XML file. So if you're using a source control system like SVN or CVS or Git, you'll likely also notice this when you do a commit and you're looking at the diffs between your check-ins. So let's move on to actually programming our app. Take a look at FortuneCrunch viewcontroller.h and FortuneCrunch viewcontroller.m. These two files combined comprise the viewController object that will control the single view in our application. The .h file is referred to as the class declaration or interface file, and sometimes it's even just called the header file. The .m file is referred to as either the class definition or the class implementation file. So the class declaration file is used to describe what our class is, and the class definition file is used to describe how our class actually works. It's where the meat of your code is going to go. And of course, on their own, both of these are just text files, and it's obviously what's inside that counts. And to demonstrate that, we're going to start from scratch. So go ahead and select everything that's in here in the FortuneCrunch viewcontroller.h file and delete it. Alright, so we're actually going to reconstruct everything from scratch. Now you may have noticed that the first several lines that we just deleted were comments, and they look something like this. But in Objective-C, you can also do this. Do a multi-line comment and then just close it with asterisk /. It's a very common and handy convention, but for consistency with the original, I will actually use the single line comments. Alright, so next we actually had an import statement. Looked like this. Import UIKit, UIKit.h. And if you're coming from a web development background, you can think of an import statement basically like an include statement. It's going to take a file or a framework that you specify and insert it into the code as though you had typed it there. The nice thing about import is that if it's already been done once, it won't do it again, and in that sense it would be something like require once in PHP. Alright, so we're importing the UIKit framework here, which means that you might be wondering what UIKit is. In many ways, UIKit is sort of the heart of Cocoa Touch. It includes many of the classes that are unique to iOS, such as UI button, UI image, UI view controller, etc. We're now going to actually make this class declaration or interface file an interface file by using the @interface statement. And as you can see from the autocomplete feature, the syntax for declaring a class interface is @interface class name colon superclass name if applicable, opening curly bracket, any ivars you want to have in your class, closing curly bracket, and then your method definitions, or I'm sorry, your method declarations, sometimes also called method signatures. So we're going to match our class name to the file name. I just selected that by hitting tab. I'm going to call it FortuneCrunch view controller. It's going to autofill. And because we want to inherit all the functionality from UI view controller, we're going to make that our superclass. And next we're going to declare two ivars, one for each of the elements that we added in Interface Builder to the view. We'll do that with these lines. So the way you declare an ivar is you put the class name, UI button, then you put an asterisk, and then your name for the object. In this case, it's cookie button. So if you recall, we have a UI button and a UI label, cookie button fortune label, and that just leaves this keyword, IB outlet. IB outlet is otherwise meaningless, except that it will signify to Interface Builder that this particular object you're creating can be connected and manipulated in Interface Builder. So if we were doing everything programmatically, you could just take that out and it wouldn't matter. But because we are using Interface Builder, you obviously need to have it. Alright, so we want both of these to be properties of the class. And we'll create these and declare these rather as properties by doing property, non-atomic, retain, UI button, cookie button. Similarly for the label. So one interesting note at this point is that you could actually put IB outlet either up here or down here or both. And generally I actually like to put IB outlet in both spots just so that it's exceedingly clear that this is an outlet. As for the rest of these statements, @property is easy enough to understand. It's declaring that this should be a property of the class. Then we have non-atomic and retain, which deal with the way that these properties will be accessed, changed, and retrieved by the class, and we'll get into that more in a future tutorial. I'm not going to dive too deeply into that now. Nevertheless, just go ahead and memorize the syntax for creating most of your IB outlet elements. Okay, so finally, what we're going to do is declare our method. Crunch cookie. And this is what we want to be called when the user actually places their finger down on the cookie button. So the syntax for declaring methods is to place either a minus or a plus sign here, and to specify a return type, and then to have what the method name is. In our case, we're using a minus sign, and that means that this is going to be an instance method. That is, it's a method that's called on an object that's been instantiated. If we used a plus sign, we would be saying that this should be a class method, which is a method that's called on the actual class itself, not an instance or object of that class. Switch that back to a minus. Now the return type that we specify is IBAction, and IBAction is actually synonymous with void or nothing. We only use it here, again, because we're using Interface Builder, and so we want to be able to connect this particular method with a button event in an Interface Builder. And if we were accepting parameters, we'd have to specify that here as well, but since we aren't, you can worry about that later. All right, and the last thing we need to be sure that we have is this @end statement to signify that this is the end of our interface declaration. Okay, so go ahead and save your work, and we'll switch back to Interface Builder. Having just declared a label and a button in Xcode, we need to sync those objects up with what we've already placed onto the view in IB. To do that, we're going to use this zib window. Alright. Specifically, we're going to use this icon called FileZoner. Now, if you look at FileZoner in the inspector and you go over to the information tab, or identity tab rather, you'll see that the class for FileZoner is FortuneCrunch view controller, and that is the same as the class declaration file that we just created. So if you control click on FileZoner, you'll see that we have some outlets here that we wouldn't have had before. Those are the ones that we just created, cookie button and fortune label. So you can actually drag from the circle here, from fortune label. You'll see that it highlights the UI label we placed on the view. You want to select that. You can see that the connection was successful. And what we've just done is we've synced the IB outlet that we declared in our class with the one that we placed on the view and interface builder, meaning that we can now reference that in our code. We want to do the same with cookie button. That's it for syncing our IB outlets. But you'll recall that we also had an IB action. So to do that, we're going to select the button, control click, and then come down to any one of these. Actually, we could use any one of these events to sync it with the IB action that we specified. The most common ones that you'll use in here are touch up inside and touch down. Touch up inside is the standard one used for buttons, and what it does is if someone places their finger down on a button, then they touch up while still having their finger inside that button, hence touch up inside, this event will fire. Touch down is also commonly used, and what it will do is the second that it notices a touchdown on the button, it will fire the event. So we're going to drag from that one over to FileZoner, and you'll see that a list of IB actions will appear. We only have one IB action, crunch cookie, and we need to be sure that we actually select that. So when you select that, you can see that represented in our other pane, and we know that it's connected. Alright, that's it. We now have our IB outlets and our IB actions synced, so we're going to save our work. Going to File, Save, then we're going to switch back to Xcode. And our next step is to code our class implementation file, which is the .m file. And just as with the header file, it's just a text file on its own. It's what's important, what's in it is what's important. So let's start from scratch and delete everything in here. Like before, we'll start this file off with the standard boilerplate comments. And our first step in the implementation is actually to import our declaration. Alright, so you might justifiably be wondering why we need to use two files for this. Why not simply type in the entire interface here and then begin with the implementation? And you actually could do that. But by convention, you keep the two separated and use this import statement instead. There's actually some good reasons for that, but I don't want to get into them now. Suffice to say that you will sometimes see both in one file, and there's not anything really inherently wrong with that. Okay, so just as we began our interface file by saying @interface, we're now going to begin our implementation file by saying @implementation. You can see the autofill is handy here as well. It's going to tell us kind of what the basic syntax is. It's @implementation, then a class name, then the methods that we're going to be defining, and then the @end statement. So we'll hit tab here and type in FortuneCrunch view controller. Now the first thing that we want to do actually deals with the properties that we declared in our header file. And so we declared them there. We said we want to have these properties, and now we're going to synthesize them. It's normally a two-part process. Synthesize cookie button and synthesize fortune label. And what the synthesize statement is going to do is it's going to automatically generate the getter and setter methods. That is the way that these properties will be retrieved and set later on in our application. In many languages, you have to manually write these out yourself, so this is really just a handy time-saving feature of Objective-C 2. Alright, so we're going to move on to the methods section here, and we're going to define our crunch cookie method. So when this method is executed, I'm going to change the image of cookie button. And then I'm going to set the fortune label's hidden property to false. Alright, so if you're new to Objective-C, this line should look incredibly confusing to you, especially since I didn't end it correctly. Here we go. You need to have another bracket there. Alright, but that should look confusing to you. Basically what's happening is we're saying, alright, take the cookie button object and call the setImage forState method on it. And for the setImage portion, we're going to pass in this parameter, which is actually a UI image that we're creating on the fly here, called with the name cookiecrunch.ping. And then for state, we're going to pass in this parameter, which is UI control state normal. It's a constant. And what we're actually achieving is we're basically changing the default the default state image that we set in Interface Builder from cookie closed to cookie crunched. Then on the next line, we set the hidden property to false for fortune label. Now the hidden property, if you remember, is actually that checkbox that you checked in Interface Builder that said hidden. So if that was setting it true, hidden to true, now we're going to set it to false, and the fortune label will display at the same time that we change the default image. Alright, so that's it for our method. I'd like to say that that's all you have to do. I'd like to say that, but unfortunately there are a few more methods that you're basically always going to have to put into your code that deal with memory management. These methods are actually inherited from UI view controller. We're going to override them here, and they are viewDidUnload and dlock. So the viewDidUnload method is called when the device gets low on memory and it's trying to figure out what it can free. In such a case, views that are in memory, taking up memory, but not currently displayed on screen are a great thing to release, so it's going to do that. And you need to make sure that any objects that you've added in Interface Builder are also released at that time. To do so, it's going to look like this. And don't worry too much about the syntax now. We'll get into that more later when we talk about memory management. Now the dlock method is actually called when an object is about to be deallocated from memory or kind of destroyed. You can think of it in that way. And so you also want to be sure that you're releasing any objects that you have allocated memory for within that object. So we'll do a very similar thing. And again, don't worry too much about the syntax. It'll come with time and with a future tutorial on memory management. Actually, there is one more thing though. We need to add super dlock. So if you remember, dlock is inherited from the UI view controller, and we're actually overriding it. So we want to do our custom releases here, and then we want to call super and allow our parent class to also deallocate whatever it may have allocated right now as well. Okay, at this point I'm guessing you're ready to see the results of all this work. So stop the simulator from running, save your changes, and then build and run the application. When you tap it, there you go, happy iPhone hacking. Alright, so congratulations on completing the second tutorial in our series on iOS development. As you can probably tell at this point, iPhone development with Objective-C has a steep learning curve. But hopefully, after completing this tutorial, you're more comfortable with the Xcode and Interface Builder, and you're beginning to get some of the fundamentals of Objective-C and development with Cocoa Touch. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. So until next time, happy iPhone hacking!